So, we decided to start. I would like to welcome you all to our conference, Interdisciplinary Research in Development Studies. We are going to start with the interdisciplinary panel. As long as our keynote is not there, we thought this is the best way to proceed. But before we start with the panelists should know who they are. We have Franziska Müller, we have Detlef Müller-Mahn, we have Petra Dannecker, who is not here. Oh, okay. Okay. So I would ask the panelists already to take their seats, and Kurt Jakobait as facilitator. I would also like to take the opportunity to, first of all, thank you all for being here, but also thank the organizers here at ZEF for making this event possible. First of all, Judith Ehlert, Irit Igwavon, and Fatih Ziriga, but also many thanks to Amir Hossein-Pur, Marvin Weibel, Gabi Weibel, and Serge Birtel. A special thank you also to Detlef Müller-Mahn and the Geography section, the Geographischer Arbeitskreis Entwicklungstheorie, for the conceptual preparation. And a special thanks to Konrad Schetter, former acting director of the Department for Political and Cultural Change at the Center of Development Research, but now director of the Bonn International Center for Conversion, because originally it was his idea, and he was the one who decided to finance this event through the ZEF budget. So, now we'll start with this interdisciplinary panel, which takes place on the basis of the discussions we had yesterday or beforehand in the sections, in the geography section, in the sociology section, and the political science section. And I would now hand over the word to Kurt Jakobait.
Thank you, Aram. Good morning to everyone from my side as well. Aram introduced the speakers here on the panel. I'm a bit surprised because I wasn't aware of the fact that I'm right in here now for the facilitator. It's no problem. Being in the development business, we're all very keen at improvising and trying to make the best of situations that come a bit unforeseen. What we have been doing in the section on political science research and development matters yesterday was to try to look at our self-understanding with respect to this research area, with respect to the role that development research plays in political science at large. And my suggestion would be that we do give the panelists at the beginning something like 5 minutes or so to talk a bit about the discussions in the various fields, and then we will try to synthesize some of the arguments that have been made and of course open it up to the floor. So I'm not sure which section wants to get started. We can talk about it. Why don't you go ahead? Yeah, okay, great.
Okay, also good morning from my side. And thanks for the organizer and also for this idea of having this panel, because I had a feeling yesterday in our section that it was very fruitful having an occasion to really discuss about these things, which are normally taken for granted and are not really discussed in the meeting. So thanks again for organizing it. For the development sociology and social anthropology section, we had a broad variety, or we do have a broad variety of issues, phenomena, and themes we are working on, and so we try to figure out what is special, what is the strength, and what is specific about our work historically as well as currently, And I just would like to pinpoint some aspects we discussed and also would ask the others to add if I forget some important points later in the discussion. So we discussed mainly that what we think is special is the perspective on local and global relations, the perspective on inequalities, interactions and relations, and also to look at this kind of networking already at a time when most of the other disciplines were still focusing on the nation state as the main frame of reference, and of course also the power structures and the asymmetries which do exist on a global level. And we are also discussed that we are aware, of course, that historically, and we can discuss this then how far this goes until today, that of course we are also aware that we, and we might also discuss this when we talk about post-development maybe, of course we're also part of this constructing the others. I mean, it's a kind of historical burden we are aware of in social anthropology as well as in development sociology. Nevertheless, and then of course the intention and the motivation and the perspective we choose could of course be discussed within this frame. However, I would like to focus, or we discuss that what we think is still, despite this historical context, we think the specific perspective is to look from a local perspective, which means also to bring local perspective concepts and alternatives into the scientific discussion. And especially from a sociological point of view, I would argue that that always implied the questioning also of concepts and categories which were from the beginning and are still, especially in mainstream sociology, not so much in social anthropology, very much referring to a Western perspective and Western societies. So that's an important point to have this local perspective. Another one is that look at similarity, regional developments, and compare them, also bringing in here other knowledge clusters, other knowledge, and another dimension where we do see a strength and which also have, of course, to be critically reflected, is this research for and about development, and especially the research about development, accompanying and criticizing intervention, trying to bring in local knowledge strategies and also local power relations. So that's a question of perspective. Another strength we discussed very vividly was the methodological and the method approach. We do have focusing on not only, but at least the people who always were active in the section, focusing on qualitative methods to really get the ITAC. I'm always struggling with an English translation. Also from an actor-oriented approach, and it's also, of course, accompanied by the importance of field work. There, our main argument would be, or turned out to be important yesterday, is to say that it's not just specifically using expert interviews or qualitative methods, but really having them theoretically embedded and also methodologically in the specific methodologically approaches. And it's a broad variety of methods which are used in development sociology and which are very much, and this is also due to this fruitful cooperation with social anthropology, also embedded theoretically. So the whole, I mean, to bring it together, the whole idea is first mainly the real sociological approach of verstehen instead of erklären, which means, first of all, also to be very empirical in the research we are doing. And it's also like Frau Lachenmann always points out, actually empirically embedding global and transnational processes currently. Okay, as I said already, to bring it, to sum it up, field research is an important pillar, and which also led to the fact that because the gender-specific structuration of processes, transformation phenomena were always an issue which was discussed in our section, and also the reflexivity of the way we are doing research, and also, of course, reflexivity concerning the kind of knowledge we are producing through this kind of research and field work we are doing. And I think in this area there is a lot of need to discuss it further. And that was the point, because one of the questions which was asked was how we position ourselves towards post-development approaches. And I think we do have different positions, but the main outcome was actually to say that a lot of what is debated in post-development approaches are issues which have been discussed also differently in the past as well, which doesn't mean that we appreciate the discussion, because it brings important points back to our awareness as well. So there are some approaches and dimensions which are new or which are discussed from another perspective, and we also think, and that's the last point now, where we position ourselves. I think we always had a problem from the beginning to really be taken seriously for mainstream sociological discussion, discourse, and from a disciplinary point of view. But we have the feeling that there is an increasing interest from the student side, that what we all observed in the different, coming from different universities and different places, there is an increased awareness or interest on development sociology or development research, and and I also think, or we think, we have a lot to offer, which might be hopefully taken more seriously into account also by mainstream sociology, and that is something which we think were also a strength, is that we have quite early tried to hint to the interrelationness of relations, and also to open categories the discipline is using.
Okay, thanks a lot for summing up this discussion in the sociology, development sociology and anthropology section from yesterday. I think what we do now, we just turn straight to the other sections, and then after the various presentations, we try to look into similarities, differences, and points of connection. So next would be the section on political research and development.
Yeah, thanks very much. I think coming from a political science perspective, we could identify quite a lot of parallels compared to the sociological section. However, yesterday we found ourselves in a, well, sometimes a bit uncomfortable situation, being, well, political scientists of course, but then maybe not being the most typical political scientists at all. Because I think the main difference is that political science perspectives on development research are still much more shaped by a sometimes positivist research agenda, because this is just still much more common in political science. So this made us sometimes feel a bit uncomfortable when talking about the characteristics of political science in development research, and also when talking about the typical strength, because then we always found ourselves, well, falling back to these almost classical categories of the state, the actor, the relation, power, and so on, while at the same time always trying to deconstruct these perspectives or just trying to see them from a different angle. So, in general, we would see the characteristics and strengths, as a strong focus on political theories and a focus on these typical categories such as power relations, statehood, political processes, as well as on political consultancy. And quite often we have to say that there's not much critical reflection of our role as scientists, and that's something that we think would be to be brought up more in the field of political science and development research. We'd see the strength, in kind of analyzing these classical categories such as power relations, relations between states or states and private actors in the field of development policies, and also looking at the transformation of statehood or process tracing and political change. These are things that we feel most competent with, but that's quite the typical research curriculum of political scientists, and that's also something which sometimes needs to be challenged and broken up. Regarding concepts and methods, that's maybe a bit difficult to generalize on this, because we thought, well, this debate shouldn't be so much about which methods score highest in our personal methods parts, but it should more be about what could be a typical way of how political scientists and development research are going to approach methodological questions and perspectives. And here we would say that one characteristic of political science research and development studies is a methodological pluralism, which allows a mix of different research designs, which allows to combine quite creatively qualitative research and some quantitative aspects, and also we could see that political science is more and more opening up towards the more qualitative strands of research, and it's more opening up to ethnographic research designs and fieldwork. This is a very interesting development that political sciences may be trying to drop parts of the positivist thinking, but it might also be seen as part of the problem. That's a point which I'm going to elaborate on it when coming to our perspective on field research, how political science research are actually doing field research. Because we see that political science keeps a quite broad understanding of field research. Field research is almost everything that just helps to overcome armchair analysis. So it could be actually anything between interviews or participant observation or ethnography. And field research always allows us to get kind of reality check. It allows us to test theoretical driven hypotheses. So that means that it always still comes from a deductive rather than an inductive kind of analysis. And this, of course, may sound awkward when speaking to the real anthropologists, but that's maybe sort of a positivist heritage that political scientists still carry around, making use of ethnography and making use of anthropology, but not going the whole way, but only taking the parts which are a bit more fancy, in which I easily could fit in, but not focusing on the more radical and the more epistemological questions, so like hijacking ethnography and taking it as something which could enrich our research designs, but not doing field work in terms of a 1-year stay at a remote space. So that's so. As much as we are very happy that the methods agenda of political science and development research is really opening up, we still see this as kind of a problem, because that might lead to political scientists doing field research just as a light version that maybe tends to forget about issues such as how to situate as a researcher, how to position oneself as a researcher, and so that might seem that doing fieldwork in political science might lose. That might mean that you would lose the more critical and more reflexive parts of qualitative research agendas. So how do we actually regard the post-development debate? Well, comparing with the other disciplines, we would say that political science is kind of a latecomer that is only recently starting to approach post-development, and it's still something new and exciting in the field of political science, and it might be a bit more easy to integrate a post-development research agenda, as in political science we are generally very focused on these different big research paradigms, be it positivism or post-positivism, or be it modernism or dependency theory or whatever, and thus post-development might be just placed somewhere in a nice niche, but that's of course also part of the problem, because that reduces, makes it quite easily to integrate post-development, but at the same time it's also easily to ignore the more radical challenges that post-development is actually posing. So, I mean, if we reduce post-development to just two messages, on the one side the critique of Eurocentrism, and on the other side the critique of development and modernity, what we can see quite systematically is that the Eurocentric message is getting integrated, because political science is changing. Everybody is now focusing on emerging powers and on a multipolar or polycentric world order. So critique of Eurocentrism is something which is quite easy to integrate, but the more radical part of the message, the almost fundamental critique of modernist thinking, isn't really getting through and risks to be, marginalized. That's of course part of the problem. Also, we would see that the methodological claims and challenges of the post-development research agenda are not yet reflected by political science. And in terms of these issues, there's still quite a long way to go. Last point. How do we actually see the future? Well, as ever, there were some optimist and some skeptical views on how political science, how the role of political science and development research might want to develop. And well, in the end, I would say that an optimist view was the more prominent position. Well, just as one example, in the field of area studies, we've just seen the Arab revolutions happening, and this is just kind of leading to more theoretical and methodological reflection in area studies, such as how might we need some different concepts? Do we need to broaden our understanding of actors? Do we need new methods? Did we miss out on something because we just didn't see that the Arab revolutions were coming? So at the moment, also due to this kind of polycentric world order, we would see that the future of political science perspectives is quite good, and there's still quite a lot to offer. Because these southern perspectives have just risen on the political agenda, but on the same time we also see some risks. Regarding for example the situation of development studies within the academic curricula, we would see there's quite a lot of different opportunities to do development studies, but quite often it's not framed as development studies, but it's kind of crypto development studies, because these development perspectives are often integrated into area studies or a global studies master or global political economy. On the one side, that's of course great because we get our approaches into academic teaching, but on the other side we run the risk to be marginalized with these political science perspectives and development studies. So that's in the end quite an optimistic picture, but it also means that we need to be careful and come to sound research agendas and come to sound picture of how to actually teach development studies. So, well, in the end, we're quite positive and we're quite interested on how the other disciplines might see that.
Thanks a lot for this take on the 6 issue areas on the part of political science development research. Let's just move on straight to geography.
Development geography, as part of geography, understands itself, or we understand ourselves as a multidisciplinary discipline that creates some specific problems. So we do not claim one particular field of research for ourselves, of which we say others don't research that. But what we are already seeing in comparison to the 2 previous presentations is that we are basically interested in the same questions. And I think on what we should focus and what we did in development geography during a workshop last weekend was that we tried not only to see where we are different, but also where are the complementarities in comparison to the other disciplinary neighbors. I think that's something very important for what we are doing in geography. Basically, the situation that we are confronting is that we are taking the challenges of the post-development debate as a positive challenge to question things that we have already questioned before, but that now we really have a very serious reason to question. And that goes into 2 directions. To think about our position in relation with our disciplinary neighbors, but also to think about our position within our own discipline, within geography. So what makes us different, what makes us special as development geographers within our own discipline. I think that also holds true for political science and development sociology. So basically we see 3 lines of argument, of 3, perhaps it's a bit of an exaggeration, 3 battlefields that we are in at the moment. One is the battlefield I would call developmentalism versus post-development on the 2 extremes. So part of what development geographers did over the past decades was that they focused pretty much on local contexts, and they contributed knowledge that was useful in the context of development practice. So this pragmatic side of what geography did is something that I think we should acknowledge. It was useful for the practice of development. But what the post-development debate is questioning is whether this practice is useful any longer. And of course, for that reason, we have to think about this contribution of geographical research in local contexts. And on the other hand, what post-development has been criticized for is that it's going too far. So what can we do to search for alternative approaches of development in local to regional contexts? And that's where we do see a role for geographical research. The second battlefield is something that I might call regionality versus relationality. So geography has often been seen as part of the area studies, and we do agree that regional competence or competence of doing research in particular areas and cultures and languages is a strength that we claim for ourselves. I think our neighbors will do the same thing. And we believe this is something important that we can use in our research, but it's no longer sufficient to justify why we are working in a particular context. Like if I look at myself, I've spent the past 12 years in Bayreuth, at the University of Bayreuth, and everybody in Bayreuth says that he or she is a specialist in African studies. So this is, they have a very strong background in area studies, and development is something like a no-word. So nobody of us does development research. Now I've just moved to Bonn, and all of a sudden development is a big issue. I think for myself, the best way is somewhere in between, so to combine the two. So what we take as a consequence of the second battlefield is that instead of defining our position within the area studies, we should rather look at connectivities, flows, and changes in a world that is changing very rapidly, and where a focus on one particular area is no longer sufficient to justify research. And this is based on new approaches like multi-sited ethnography, which is not at all anthropological or geographical or whatever approach, but something that's used between the disciplines. So in that respect, we would rather in the future prefer to define ourselves in terms of doing social research in the South instead of geographical development research. And then the third battlefield concerns debates between mid-range theories on the one hand and grand theory and epistemological debates within geography. And personally, I believe, and I think the majority of the participants in the workshop last weekend agreed on this point, that this is really the big challenge for us. It's not how to define our position among our neighbors, but rather to find our position within our own discipline in geography, and to find a justification for doing research in the global South, but using theoretical approaches that are currently debated in geography. And in that respect, we would see three fields of competence of geography which have nothing to do with development, but are general, particular sensitivities, if you like, in geography, not exclusively owned by our discipline, but something that many geographers tend to be interested in. And one is, well, a methodological tradition or a specialization in questions concerning spatial context. So we are fully aware that after the spatial turn, everybody is interested in space, so it's no longer our dimension, unfortunately. But that makes life a bit more complicated. But still, in geographical research, there is always, at least implicitly, this interest in what does the whole thing have to do with concepts of space. The second special interest we have in scalar connections and concepts of bridging scales, connectivity across scales, and linkages between the local and the global. So it should not only be a focus on my village in Africa, which I researched from my mud somewhere in western Kenya or so, but rather this linkage between what's happening in local contexts and the background in wider scalar connections. And then the third field of geographical interest concerns interfaces between the social, the political, but also the ecological dimensions that we're interested in. And that is also something where we would see an area of interest which may be slightly different from what others are doing. Although we, of course, we are fully aware that in political ecology, for example, political scientists are interested in the same questions. The difference might be that in geography, in the curriculum of university studies, students do study both social and natural or physical geography. So they do have some kind of professional background to study these interfaces between the social and the natural world. So to come to an end, as I said, the real challenge for us is not to get along with our neighbors, because I think we do share a lot of interests and questions, but rather to position ourselves in our own discipline, which is not the topic of today here for this conference. And in order to perhaps help us to redefine our position within geography, and perhaps the same holds true for you, it may be useful to come to an understanding where and why we do need our disciplinary labels.
Thanks very much for this third presentation. What we can do now is essentially get into some discussion here on the podium, but I think there are a couple of questions that are strikingly enough and a lot of interest devoted to those that make it very useful, I think, for opening up to the discussion. But if there is a brief comment or a brief addition to what has been said just now, then please go ahead. And I'll try to summarize some of these general questions that strike me as being important enough for the discussion.
Thank you very much. And it's really short and might be also a point for the discussion. Taking up your last point, and you are completely right, I think that's also something we discussed yesterday, and I always ask myself, why do we really have to do that? I mean, do we have development as a transdisciplinary phenomena, taking into account that we cannot analyze it, look at it from a disciplinary perspective, and instead of trying to have this kind of identity and trying to get part of the discipline, instead trying another way of building up something different. I mean, it doesn't have to be a discipline, or we don't have to necessarily call it discipline, but I think it's very intensive also to have this kind of conflict of getting accepted and find a place within the disciplinary mainstream. And the question is whether this is really necessary, or whether we should, having so many things in common, better try to develop something new, like development studies or whatever, without the political and without the geographical and without the sociological term in the title. I mean, just as an idea, maybe also for discussion how important this disciplinary embeddedness really is.
Yes, I think that's essentially the key question that strikes me as being the summary of the three presentations that we should definitely explore during this discussion, what the kind of commonalities are and whether these commonalities are sufficient to move ahead beyond, if you like, the disciplinary boundaries. There are, of course, a couple of arguments to be made why disciplinary boundaries are important. The fact that when you are going for an academic or research career, then your career path is normally defined within your discipline, and you do not score when you are using methods that are applied by other disciplines. You are normally refereed by people that are believed to be in the proper discipline and who have not much of an interest in those other disciplines at all. So there is a certain danger in the career path by just moving beyond. But my understanding of science is that, yes, of course, only at these border areas of one's own discipline are the fruitful approaches to be gone for, to be looked after. The first question that I would like to maybe ask first the panelists, but then really open it up to the floor at large, is what do you think are there, essentially, what's the most striking thing is, are there any differences left among the three disciplines here on the podium? Would you say that listening to the other summaries of these workshops, aren't we just doing more or less the same thing? We all feel that the field and these areas are very important, that there is, of course, a fundamental theoretical, methodological change underway that affects us all. Yes, we are somehow pressured by the major discipline that we're in, because we always have to defend why we are there and what we have to do. So lots of similarities that came up listening just to the three presentations. What would be your take? Where do you see major fundamental differences left? Or is it just, we should just leave it behind and really say, well, they're so similar, why don't we move ahead and look into the future and trying to define a proper discipline that is made up of these various strands?
Major difference, I wouldn't say so, no. But there are differences, and I think it's good to have the differences and to be aware of these differences. And one that I would see is that out of tradition, or whatever you would like to call it, we do have different preferences for methodological approaches. which are useful. As a geographer, I don't insist that somebody who's writing a PhD with me has a map in his PhD thesis, but there is a preference. There are things with a map, and I don't mind if you have one. And for an anthropologist in cooperative projects, I was always welcomed that they said, "Ah, that's very nice as a geographer with us because they know how to do a map." Okay, I don't mind, and we all agree that it's not really an important thing, but to have these different competences, and to have a political scientist who's reading the newspapers is also something very nice in such a project. So let's make something out of this methodological project.
Well, of course, I hope that everybody else reads the paper too, but that's right. There are essentially, I think, in the various disciplines, there are some methodological, I would also argue, some lines of contestation within the discipline that are not directly associated with the development research agenda in the first place. But yes, the disciplinary binding that we're still in makes for some differences in approaches, but just the general theme that I seem to have heard listening to these three presentations is that with respect to some of the challenges, some of the theoretical innovations that are out there, and the repositioning that it forces onto these three disciplines in development research, there are a lot of similarities. But the other ones on the panel disagree.
Well, I would still see quite some differences coming from a political science perspective, because I think they're just still carrying around these political science categories such as statehood and whole nations and so on. Well, to some kind, there's something positive, that's some kind of merit, because it makes, it's some of the base of our competencies, but still I'm asking myself, to what extent could this heritage be also kind of a burden that makes it more difficult to integrate other concepts and to, integrate sociological approaches, or be part of this, or be actually part of the spatial term. But after all, I would say, political science is always very much about these different terms, be it ethnographic term, or sociological term, or practice term, or spatial terms. So I would also see that our discipline is changing very much, but here I think the question should be, to what extent are these terms real terms, or to what extent is it just to what extent is it just getting the nice parts and nice facets of some other approaches, and leaving out the whole research agendas.
Maybe very short. I do think I would completely agree with what you just said. I think it's to a certain extent also difficult because there are some different theoretical stands we come from, and this also of course influences not the methods but how we understand the methods we are using. And there is a certain difference which is not always so easily combined. But the point is, I think this can be done, and that's for me actually the challenge, because we do have this challenge in our disciplines as well. So the point is really, where to put the focus and the interest here on. But just because you said reality check, and this is something, where from the sociological point of view, what I just said, it's the first thing is to understand before. So I think it's a different perception about what reality really is and how can we analyze it, how can we understand it before we might explain certain processes, whether they are political, social, economic, whatever. And I think there is something which is necessary to discuss, and but I don't think it's something which cannot be overcome or might be, as you just said, an important way forward, and a reorientation out of the discipline into focusing on the phenomena which is actually in the focus of all our research and all our efforts in this field.
I could completely subscribe to that, but I think that's also kind of this positivist heritage that we're carrying about it. Actually, I would like to overcome perception of methods, and especially ethnography, just as something like reality check that tells us if our hypotheses are right and can be verified or falsified, I say, but that's still something that's quite, it's quite sort of a hidden agenda within many political science, research designs and case studies, but I think we have to be very aware and very careful of that, and I think here the sociological discipline can be really helpful.
Okay, there are no fundamental questions from the floor on the three panelists and on the presentations of the various disciplines. Are there any questions on the three disciplines and the way that they have been presenting their take on field research, on methods, on the future, on their relations to the major discipline, etc.? If that is the case, not there is.
It's not a question at this point. I don't know what you want to turn to a general discussion now, or
I was opening the floor for some questions on these presentations, and then I would really like to focus the discussion on the future, what this analysis of the three disciplines, the state of the art, where they are, and what that would imply, and where that takes us. But if there are any comments right at this point with respect to the disciplines, then please go ahead. No, they're not. Good. Okay. Yes.
I have a question to all three panelists. So how normative do you think are your approaches?
I don't know if everyone heard the question. How normative is the approach in the various three disciplines? Okay. Any other questions? Doesn't seem to be the case.
just with regard to geography and sociology or the papers, you just mentioned that you are not concentrating on the local knowledge and the regional knowledge and the specialization. And even I've never learned any African language, unfortunately, because of that. But as a sociologist, we are rather oriented. But I think it would be a danger to pick up this specialization, possibility of specialization on a certain region. And not only for the empirical facts, the reality, but also for the tradition of thinking of scientific disciplines. For example, on Francophone West Africa, there has been very early development just of classical Marxism, really, about articulation, about linking, as we said, about relations, and not only just one village in the group. And I always consider it this when a social anthropologist really talks the language and really knows the local situation. The thing is, and we could discuss it later on about the future, how are we participating and getting a foot in the door in this globalization field? And for example, in Bielefeld, we have this global system theory, and also in political science, we have the big comparisons. We couldn't just only positivists, we have to get a foot in. And the problem is that up to now we are very much labeled as the never I think in sociology it's worse than
Okay. Essentially, two questions on the podium. First one: how normative is the discipline? That's a question for the three of you. And the other one is already directed towards the future of this interdisciplinary cooperation. How much of a local roots do we still need, and to what extent are we obliged to open up to these broader debates that somehow seem to capture more attention, i.e. globalization, the world changes that are going on, etc. I mean, do we have to give up our local roots in order to be listened to and heard in these debates, or is there a connecting point between a sound local understanding of what is happening in these areas, and do we have to think about ways of making heard what we find out and what we learn about our local expertise, and then to get it to proper attention? These two questions, maybe the panelists could address them in turn.
Well, I begin with Müller-Mahn. Your question concerned what I said. I think there was a misunderstanding. I don't want to argue that we should give up focusing on the local, but we should understand the local in global context, and I think we agree on that point. That the focus on the local itself, without acknowledging that we do no longer have a local if we don't understand the wider world. I think that that's still necessary. What we have to focus on looking into the future is to understand how to bridge scales, how to understand connections, how to look at processes from a bottom-up and at the same time from a top-down perspective. So it's more like this opening up than just looking at the local versus the global. As to Hans-Georg Bohle's question concerning the normativity and what we're doing, this is something I forgot to present as one of the main points we had in our discussion at the workshop last weekend. This is actually with what we are struggling. What about this? Our understanding of doing research based on a normative background, studying development as something towards a big plus or something better. Post-development debates would question this position. Would say, well, we shouldn't go too far of defining what is better and not better, but rather to understand what is happening. What we discussed in our group among development geographers is that this normative background of what we are doing is not only an understanding of better or worse, but it is something of being involved, of defining our position as being part of the world, of looking at problems, if you want to name them, as such, that have something to do with human suffering, with injustice, and with situations to which we do not agree, where we say this is wrong and things have to be changed. So the normative background concerns more our political involvement in what we are studying. And in that respect, I think it is still an important driver why people are doing research about issues that we formerly called development, and that we now call whatever, where we should get involved and not only accept the word as it is.
Yeah, I think there's quite some similarities in the field of political science, and still it's a bit difficult to generalize on that. On one side, I would see, we regard political science and development studies as something quite, problem-oriented, interested in problem solving and being practice-oriented, and this might at first place sound as just something very practical and something value-neutral, but of course there's always the hidden agenda of, development as the bigger picture, as the whole, as something good, something that political science should work in favor of, and on the other side there's of course this kind of critical tradition which is normative, which may be much more open about being a normative approach as being critical of power relations or focusing on colonial heritage or sub-alternatives. So there's also the thing of being political involved, and being political involved in the first place, and so that's would also be a kind of a normative agenda, but of course a kind of agenda which is much more visible, whereas the problem-oriented kind of political science development studies would regard itself as much more value neutral, but here this kind of normative agenda maybe would have to be much more unveiled.
Very shortly, because I would very much agree on what was said. I think the problem is, and what is discussed, and what I assume we are all discussing, is that the frame of reference we are using categories, what I said before, are still, of course, very important. And it's the question really how. I think the important thing is really to reflect about it, and it's not meaning that it can be solved by reflecting about it, but by being aware of it. And I think that's maybe the first step in this process. But of course, it's even so not on the agenda. It's of course the hidden agenda, which is always still behind, especially when we do think about the area, what I said before, doing studying development politics, for example, and I think it's very difficult to really find another approach which actually is not normative in the perspective. And I think that that's really a challenge, and that comes back to what you said about the developmentalism, to really say that's something we are not doing any longer. I mean, the whole sense of this kind of political field. But it's, I think it's something which needs to be discussed and which will probably occupy us for some more time when, I mean, or even it's not something which actually can be solved.
Yes, of course, that's what I would also answer with respect to normativity, because that's a general debate that I always run into when I discuss post-structural or post-positivist approaches with students. They always want to know whether that means that everything is now relative, and I always explain to them, no, that's the reason why I insist as a political human being that I have certain values and that it's important to turn them into the open, not to just leave them in the back, but you have to turn them into the open when you are making analysis and when you make, more importantly, when you make recommendations. Because if it's not clear what the basis of these recommendations really is, what the basis is, then you are not just losing the argument, but you're losing yourself as a researcher in a particular discipline. Okay, let's turn to this most important question now, which is that a joint conference is a good starting point, but a good starting point for what? Because similarities, well, some differences were left. Mind you that we will later in the afternoon also have the opportunity to discuss our various approaches to theories, methods, and to the field and to research at large. But if the consensus seems to be relatively broad, that we share a lot more things than what is different with respect to how we work and what our interests are and the methods we use and the challenges we're confronted with, where does that take us to with respect to future collaboration or future joint research activities? Maybe first addressed to the panelists and then but definitely also open to your questions and comments on the floor.
May I start? I'm coming from an institute, Development Studies, which is claiming to be transdisciplinary, and honestly speaking, it's a permanent challenge. And I, sitting here today now, I feel that there are much more similarities actually, which we have on this in this section than we do have in the institute with the classical economists, and so there are. I know how difficult it is, but for the future, I think maybe we have a certain limit of reading and keeping ourselves informed what really is taking place in other disciplines or in areas which we are representing here today. So I think the first step would actually be the idea whether it could not be organized something together. First of all, also for getting a kind of introduction more deeply than we could do it today. And I mean, I at least present the discussion, which was much broader and where much more positions were articulated. So I think this would be really a first step, which I think for myself would be very fruitful, because I realize today that we also tend to take approaches from geography, for example, as it's probably the other way around, but really discussing more intensively also where the interfaces or connection would be, would, at least from my point of view, the first step, even so I know that, and not discuss about what different definitions and ideas we do have about development. I think that doesn't really brace us forward, and that's what I'm doing all the time. So I don't think it's very helpful. I mean, it might be to take a certain issue and then try to discuss it from different perspectives and present the different perspectives. I think it would be a very fruitful approach. Also, I know that it's time consuming and that it's a lot of organizing behind it. But I think I would really appreciate it, because I think we have much more in common than what we normally realize by doing our work in our little frame.
If I look back at the long history of this section, it's not really a section, the club of development geography, German development geographers, over the past 40 years or so, we had regular meetings where we invited speakers from neighboring disciplines, because we felt the need of importing theory from neighboring disciplines, especially in humanities, into what we were doing. And quite interestingly, this has come to an end over the past 5 to 10 years or so. So we are no longer, I mean, we are some of the boundaries open. We don't feel that we have to import something from somewhere else, because what we're discussing is more or less the same. And for that reason, my interest in what you are doing is not because we are development sociologists or development political science, but because we are sociologists or political scientists. And I think that this exchange in which we are engaging is an exchange of theoretical debates that informs our empirical research. And our contribution to this debate in development geography has been primarily in having a very sound basis in empirical research, which, at least we try to do that, informs theoretical debates.
Yeah, I would also say that I'm regarding these disciplinary boundaries more and more as kind of a crusade that would be open, because it would seem much more, well, just normal to me to talk about development studies in general, and not always identify oneself just as part of the political science discipline or as part of the sociological discipline, because there are so many, well, similarities. The research agendas are opening up into both sides, and I think it's more for the reason of, well, some academic constraints and academic representation and career paths, that we're still so much thinking within the different disciplines, but it's something that wouldn't actually fit to the topic of development studies. It's that creates kind of a strange mixture that, well, most of the work within development studies is interdisciplinary, but still we always have to locate ourselves within a discipline, and that seems quite awkward, and quite often it just doesn't fit. And I mean, political scientists often borrow methods from other disciplines and have to, well, yeah, crunch it into our subject, and well, opening up would be, for me, just the most normal thing to do.
Yes, I would like to come back to the question whether we are one or we are different. And I think there's some internal consensus that we bring in strength of our discipline and working together as beneficial, and there's a kind of interesting questions. But for the outside world, yeah, people that don't sit here, the reality is that they think we are one. They only lump us together on some interdisciplinary projects, development research projects. They lump us together, they label us social science.
Okay.
Yes, what I want to say goes a little bit to the same line. I mean, I have the impression that at the moment the panelists are trying to eliminate a little bit our differences. I think that if we work really on certain issues, we see that the differences are there. And we are working now in an interdisciplinary project. And how many articles do they have written by a geographer and a social anthropologist together? I mean, there are very few ones. And reading our texts, when we try to publish something together, working on the same issue, we see that we are reading our texts completely different. Our understanding of the texts are different. And I think there is a lot of enrichment we can and we should do this, because we can learn still. We are not at the end. We can still learn about with each other. But I would agree with you when you said that we should, in such a conference, we should not take development as the topic, but to work really on taking an issue and then work and see what the geographer or the political scientist. I think that the geographer and the anthropologists are still closer than the political scientists, or even sometimes the sociologists. So I feel closer to the geographers, and the understanding is more than sometimes also the sociologists. This is a kind of methodology and our history. But I think the differences are there, and we should have much more discussion about this on a particular topic.
Okay. I have, if you permit, we have 2 more questions that we are going, 3 more questions. Well, depending on what they are, I am inclined to have them now positioned, and so we have a final round of our panelists before we then move on to the break. But I think we're also at a point where the general consensus that seemed to be at the beginning, we're all the same, is now a bit challenged. That's of course always fruitful for getting a new insight here.
Yeah, well, I wanted to go back to the same question, because if I understood my colleague from geography right, it was, well, we are sort of geographers, political scientists, or sociologists working on in different empirical areas. I don't think we're only that. I think we do share some methodological or ontological even commonalities, which is a sort of a global history or society as a global structure, a relational aspect. Most of us even share some normative concepts. If you're interested in inequalities, and most of us are, there are some normative assumptions going with it. It's a view that there aren't any people from global history, which would have an enrichment to the debate. But I think, if I'm not completely wrong with the commonalities, wouldn't this be a chance to try to sort of construct a common forum for theoretical, methodological questions and interchange, so that we could try and challenge a bit more than we do within the discipline, the main disciplines, because I think we got something to offer.
Okay, thank you.
Just a short comment. I subscribe to almost everything that's been said. Coming from geography, I guess collaboration with neighboring disciplines is a matter of course. And I do think that we do share a lot of topics. But on the other side, debates on these topics are not synchronized. If we think of post-development debate, I think we've had this in geography 10, 12, 15 years ago. It's probably being revived now. And it's probably only now we've learned that political sciences are sort of opening up to that discussion. So there's a lot of time lag between the debates. I would share a certain amount of skepticism about the programmatic collaboration, because the debates we have just different stages in the course of discussion.
Okay, thank you.
I think it would be a possibility to retain disciplinary competences retaining disciplinary backgrounds, but still to collaborate in an interdisciplinary project, maybe just like Indiana, which is focused, well, which should be reframed actually as studies of global inequality and improving livelihoods, because this is actually what we're doing. We call it development studies, but well, we all know that development has almost as many meanings as it has users of the term, and I think I still would like to make a suggestion of reframing this project and in a bit more specific, more focused way, more honest way, to my mind, as the study of global inequality and the study of improving livelihoods. Global inequality and what we can do about it. Yeah.
Okay. Lots of food for thought for the panelists for a final round here. As I said, why don't we do it and try again?
Thanks. To the last point, I think I don't like this livelihoods, but I think the global inequality is something which we are also discussing to get the development out of the title. We had this discussion yesterday in our session, and it's a question which, from my point of view, also goes along with the question of we have not really talking about. We have talking about areas, we have talking about regions, but we have not really talked about, and which is at least for me an increasingly important question, and which would, I think, go very much along with your proposal to change the global inequalities, is the question where development research actually takes place. I mean, we have still avoided to talk about regional and geographical aspects. I think, and that's something I have not really thought through, but I think it's important to think about. Such a redefinition could allow to point out more significantly that we do have certain approaches, certain methodology to study global inequalities independently where the global inequalities are to be observed. I mean, it's more taking certain theoretical concepts, methodological approaches, and then it would also, from my point of view, to think further, to frame it from a more theoretical, methodological point, and not always putting a certain area or region in the focus, because that's also something we are getting defined from outside. You know, these are the specialists, not for emerging countries, but for, you know, the African countries in social anthropology, and this is something which is then special and which can't be really transferred or really have any impact on general theoretical reflection. So I think this is really something which is worth to think about, or better to discuss. I think it's not that easy. I personally do think, and I would like to make this argument again, that it doesn't make sense, as you said, to really, and also what Maria said, to discuss about on a very general level, but to really think what are issues which we identify each other with, or which are also a political, motivation to do this kind of research and studies we are actually doing, and then to discuss very concretely and to see whether it's really the case, as you said. And just when I listened to your comment, I was thinking that even within the sections we do have many different approaches, and we have many different methodological informed research. So the point is, it's not just equalizing or not talking about differences between our approaches, but even within the different areas. And I think we shouldn't try to make one soup out of it, but to really see where is the potential of others which can inform us and also inform our research to really work on the issue on global inequalities with the proposed result.
Yeah, I'll be quite briefly on that. I found some of the commentaries very interesting who focus on, well, now are we the same or are we not, and are we actually identified as being all the same, and what are the risks of such perception? I would say, yeah, of course, that's a very risky thing to be just taken as some kind of social scientist. But still, at the moment, our standing as doing development studies within political science is something really awkward, and it feels, within our discipline, it's a kind of marginalization, and beyond the discipline, it would make much more sense. So I would say, of course, we would have to bring the strengths that are critical of political science in, but yeah, to me, talking about development studies or talking about global inequality studies is very much a cross-cutting subject with a broad methodological and broad disciplinary agenda, and I wouldn't see the future within these kind of disciplinary boundaries, but I would see the future within a cross-cutting agenda where these different disciplines and also political science itself can just make a specific argument but share much more common positions.
Well, the underlying question we've discussed here was about convergence between neighboring disciplines versus maintaining distinctions of specializations, questions, methods, methodological approaches. And I don't see this as a contradiction. I think we should be aware of what is really important, and that is where does scientific innovation come from. And it always comes from different opinions, from debates, from dialectics. If we were becoming the same, at least one of us would become redundant. And of course we don't want to lose one of us on the way.
Okay, I think that we should, at this point, sum it up in the sense that a suggestion is always difficult to make at the end of a discussion that somehow was, to my understanding, starting out with this whole notion of convergence and are we more or less the same, and are there any differences left? And at the end, that has been a bit challenged, or even maybe at the beginning, because I mentioned that we're all, in the end, when we are working in research, we're depending on acceptance in the discipline, first and foremost, because the jobs are allocated according in research at universities in the disciplines and not in the subfield, in the specialization. So that is, if you like, a grounding when it comes to the job market that reminds us that convergence and moving together and giving up our distinctiveness is also a certain danger with respect to one's own livelihood. But that's only as a sign. In general, I would think that the overall discussion underlines the convergence and the similarities and the questions, and that of course has to do with the subject that we're studying. When it comes to my take on the next step, my suggestion would be that the boards of the 3 sections here involved should seriously consider about a follow-up conference that would not be based on adding up the 3 sections, where the 3 sections have the slot in the morning, the first one, and the second one in the afternoon, etc. But what we really should do as a next step is think about a topic that we want to approach from the perspective of the 3 subsections. Because that would be a way to learn a bit more intensively and more deeply as to how the various disciplines really converge on the approach of these topics and where the differences are, and probably also more to learn from each other with taking this common perspective. By the way, that does not foreclude the perspective of thinking about how the convergence or this sense of being closer to one another than to the rest of the discipline or to other disciplines, how that should not in a later stage be converged or transferred into some common activities in the sense of moving beyond just studying topics, the usual thing we do. But I think the necessary next step is really a common topic that we define, and suggestions should be made within the various boards and the section discussions that we still have time left to do during these 2 remaining days of the conferences, and then really, as a next step, trying to put together a conference where we all try to make a focal input on a particular topic that we hopefully can be able to agree upon. I'd like to thank the panelists here for their comments and for their summaries and their insights into these common questions. For your questions and comments, there will be now a short break, I think, and then we'll move on to the initial presentation. Thank you very much.